Then there's California. That's the name of this podcast, featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that make even a quarantined California exceptional. From a still quiet and mostly empty state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. And any look at the headlines or news stories nowadays reminds us that we are still living in confusing and sober times. And while California should be grateful and thankful that we have been ahead of the rest of the country and how we have handled this COVID-19 epidemic and avoiding many more worst-case medical scenarios, the number of infections and deaths are still too numerous in this state. And while we want to be hopeful, and though the curves are flattening and we're talking about getting out and getting back to normal, we have no choice but to calibrate our hopes and plans to the unknowns that are ahead. Meanwhile, as we speak, the members of the California State Legislature continue to be in their districts and at home working, but ready to convene session again soon, and are already thinking out of the box about how to deal with our state's new crisis economy, helping businesses and workers in their communities stay solvent and alive. And also, how to use the circumstances of this pandemic as a reset button, helping California pivot towards a more unifying future of healing and belonging. Because, a lot of communities and populations in California are living this pandemic in real time. The undocumented Californians, farm workers, low-wage but essential workers, sometimes unsafe living and working conditions, and the threat of deportations, and without access to the health and safety protections and economic stimulus that the rest of us have. And for many of them, it doesn't feel like we're all in this together. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll talk about how this pandemic is playing out and affecting those living and working outside of our urban cities and in rural mixed-status communities, how the legislature's agenda for the rest of the year is evolving towards keeping our state solvent now and in the future, and maybe includes the chance to take the inflection point this pandemic has created for us all to correct injustices and inequities for the future and give Californians the chance to be public servants for each other. Caballero is the state senator representing California's 12th Senate District, which includes the agricultural bounty and proud working ethic of California's Central Valley, including the Salinas Valley, San Benito County, Merced County, and portions of Stanislaus, Madera, and Fresno counties. Senator Caballero has been a public servant herself for 3 decades. A former local government leader, Senator Caballero served in the state assembly and for 6 years served in former Governor Jerry Brown's cabinet, serving as secretary of the Business, Consumer Services, and Housing Agency, and was elected to the Senate in 2018. Senator Caballero, like her 119 other legislative colleagues, has not been in Sacramento, but has been social distancing and working full-time within her 12th Senate District. Senator Caballero joins us by phone from her home in Salinas. This is her first time with us on this podcast. Senator Caballero, welcome to Then There's California.
Thank you so much for the invitation to join you today, Brian.
How are you doing?
I feel really blessed. It's really hard for me to stay home, and I have learned new things about myself that I never knew, which is that it's kind of difficult to say, go do your work, but do it all by yourself with a cell phone and a computer and make sure you get things done. When everything is falling apart around me, that's the hardest thing for me to do. I want to get dressed, out the door, and starting to get my hands dirty, and this has been very difficult. But, I'm working. I have a great staff. We are in communication with as many people as we can during the day, and I'm on the phone like this, having conversations 10 to 12 hours a day. But I feel blessed because I've got food, I'm working, I'm getting a salary, and it's the beginning of the growing season, and so everything is green, and there's bounty out there that feeds the world. So I feel very, very lucky, despite the fact that this is one of the worst pandemics this country has ever seen. And Brian, the real challenge is, from my perspective, is that all of the fault lines between the haves and have-nots have been magnified because of this pandemic. And so, I knew I had a district where there's incredible poverty, where there's great injustices, but they're magnified because of this pandemic. And so this really gives me the opportunity to look at the situation and to say, what are we going to have to change? what are the things we have to change substantively in the state so that we can equalize and create opportunities for people to be successful, healthy, and to earn a good living.
You have just hit the touchstone of everything I want to talk about in this podcast, so I appreciate that. But you bring up your district. Let's talk about Senate District 12. Everybody knows the Central Valley. The workers, those undocumented, the low-income Californians that I described and you've talked about in the fields and the farms and the orchards. There are more than 2 million undocumented immigrants in California, last statistic I checked, 400,000 agricultural workers in the state, and many of those undocumented immigrants and ag workers, often one and the same. A lot of them live in your district. Tell us about SD12.
SD12 is primarily an agricultural region, our major economy, and it is 2 counties and parts of 4. So it's a landmass area that's really huge. And we produce 80% of the lettuce that's consumed in this country comes out of the Salinas Valley. And there are more than, I'm trying to remember, it's something in the hundreds, products where California produces 99%. Figs, pistachios, raisins, kiwi fruit. And so if you enjoy those products, then you get them from California, and more particularly the region that I represent. It is a very, very busy industry, but the wages that are paid are not very high. We have the poorest people in the state, and families tend to live in overcrowded conditions because the rents in California are high. And so it takes a number of wage earners to be able to rent in many of our communities. So despite the fact that we have this abundance of food around us, there are many people, including a lot of children, that live below the poverty level.
I've heard you talk about your education and your career and how you wanted early on as a Latina with a law degree to find ways to help these communities and the people who live and work in them. And I think that your story is an important story to reference here because you know these farms and fields and these workers and families because you have walked the journey with them through your career and through their lives. Share some of that with us.
Well, my family is not from rural California. I grew up in Southern California, and I'm from a copper mining community, rural copper mining community in southeastern Arizona. And so I had the opportunity to see, because it was a company town, the power of the union that represented the copper miners, but just as importantly, the power of people working together to change their circumstances. And so when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do with my life, I decided I wanted to be an attorney. I was going to school during the time that Cesar Chavez was organizing farm workers, and I was really inspired by what he was trying to do, which was to get people to work together. That's the reason I went to law school, is I said, if I'm going to go an extra 3 years of college, I want to be able to do good work in the community. And my first job, I got hired by California Rural Legal Assistance to work in Salinas. And I moved to Salinas thinking I'd be living in Salinas for a few years and then move back home where my family was in Southern California. But I fell in love with the community. Some of the hardest workers are farm workers who come to California looking for a better life for them and their families. And they're willing to work their fingers to the bone. They get up every morning at 3, they're out the door by 4 on a bus, and they're working out in the field for 8 to 10 hours a day. And I was inspired by not only the farm worker movement, but also by their hard work and dedication and the need in the community that is so great. Many of these workers are undocumented, which means that they live in the shadows of our society. They're afraid of being deported. They're afraid of a culture that doesn't appreciate their hard work and that will take advantage of them at the first opportunity. So there's so much to be done. I felt like I needed to stay, and I'm still here working it.
Well, what a blessing that is, actually, Senator, that you are, because, as I said, you have an empathy and a knowledge of their lives, and that's what you're doing as a public servant. Let's fast forward to what's going on right now as the community deals with the pandemic. California's various regions have already experienced this pandemic in different ways. Let's talk about how the pandemic is playing out in California's rural communities, again, many of which are in your district. There was a feeling early on, as this started to come up earlier this year, that some of the rural communities would be spared the high numbers of the COVID cases and, by extension, the tragic deaths. But I think in other ways, with all due respect, some of these communities are kind of a powder keg, and with the fragile state of people's health and the safety and healthcare infrastructure, and with so many essential workers out there without these protections, that the tragedy would be intense. So from your perspective, how are the communities faring? Did the pandemic catch people by surprise? Have there been outbreaks on the farms?
So I think there's some ironies about how our system works and the inequities. So the Bay Area is the area that shut down very, very quickly. And I got to tell you, in rural California, we didn't even hear about any of the measures that the Bay Area was taking. They discovered the pandemic there a lot sooner than everybody else.
Right.
So I think there were many of us that really were caught by surprise, because I remember at the Capitol hearing the San Francisco-based legislators going, "We're shutting down. We're closing everything." And I thought, what? That can't be. I mean, that just can't be. How do you close down San Francisco? But they did. And so those of us in rural California have been very surprised. I think there's still a sense in many parts of my district where people feel like they really don't need to close down because it hasn't hit their community. And unfortunately, because we don't have testing, that's an assumption that can be made based on no facts. But here's the irony, and this is what makes it really frustrating to me, is that farm workers have been declared essential workers. So we've asked them to go to work and to continue to participate in a part of the economy that's going to feed the world. And I really have to take my hats off to farmers, because they are the ultimate risk takers. They get up every morning and they say, "I'm going to work despite the weather. I'm going to work despite the fact that I may not have enough workers show up for work. I'm going to work despite the fact that there may be a pest or a pestilence that comes around, or an animal that walks through the field and I can't sell my product." There are just so many things out there that can impact a farmer. But the farm workers have been asked to join the farmers and to work. They are scared. They're just as worried as everybody else that this disease is out there in the community and that it could get them. Right. If they're undocumented, they have no health care. And if they're undocumented and they don't work, they're not eligible for any of the assistance programs, the disability benefits, the sick leave benefits, the unemployment insurance benefits. And not only that, but you're an essential worker, but if we find you in the field, you can be deported. So there are all of these injustices happening that, I feel really strongly that if we're going to ask them to be essential workers, then we ought to legalize them. And the federal government has a responsibility to step up and to say, we're going to give all of the farm workers that are working because they're essential workers, we're going to give them a green card and give them a pathway to citizenship. It's very easily done. It should be done. And it would show respect and concern for a workforce that's here that is contributing to our economy. And these workers, through their salaries, pay into all the systems that they're not eligible for. So the employer on their behalf is paying for unemployment insurance. The employer on their behalf is paying for workers' compensation. The employer on their behalf is paying for disability benefits. So the fact that they're not receiving them is not fair. The other thing, and this is the part that I've been the most active on recently, is that the farm workers, many live in overcrowded housing situations because of the cost of rent. But they also are the ultimate commuters. They commute together either in a private vehicle. You'll never see a farm worker going out to the fields all by themselves. They carry friends and coworkers as a way to avoid the cost of a vehicle, and they go in buses. And so for people in the cities, they need to realize they're not single occupant drivers. These are people that are commuting together. And so the potential to become infected by someone that may be a coworker is really high because you're shoulder to shoulder with them in buses, in cars, and working on crews. So not only do they need protective equipment, but there's an education process so that they can learn not to travel that way, to do social distancing and to take wipes and antiseptics and clean everything that you come in contact with. But there's also the need for the farmers to adjust their practices so that people can socially distance. It's possible for people to be out in the field and not be shoulder to shoulder. Some of the machines require it, but they're going to have to be changed, and we got to do it differently. So it's not only the protection equipment, the mask, the gloves, the disinfectants, but it's also understanding what social distancing means and having farmers and their supervisors doing a training for the workforce so that they know how to protect themselves.
It sounds like from what you're saying that sometimes fear seems to be as much a worry as the virus itself in those communities.
That's correct. Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what? I understand, because at the beginning of this whole process, I'd wake up in the morning and I'd have a sore throat. And I'd be going, oh, my God, I just got the virus. I'm going to die. It's one of those things where you just go.
I don't mean to laugh, but yeah, I think all of us have done that. The moment we have a runny nose or it's like, oh, my God, I'm going to need a ventilator.
That's it.
Yeah.
This is it. Yeah, no, but and I say that, and I realize that if I'm thinking that way, that others are too. And so I don't mind the laughter, because I've laughed at myself ever since. Because I didn't say it out loud to anybody because I was embarrassed that people would go, man, you're losing it.
Well, I want these conversations to be as cathartic as they are informative. So I appreciate you saying that. You've hit on so many things here that, gosh, I could spend another hour and a half with you. But the issue of the green cards and the issue of citizenship, unfortunately, and I'm glad you brought it up, so I didn't have to bring it up directly myself, but we are going in the opposite direction right now with this federal government.
That's right.
And at the very least, if you can't give them the citizenship or the rights, don't penalize them further in their access and their freedoms and their movement and their freedom from fear.
That's right. Well, I have had some very critical conversations with different organizations and farm worker organizations, as well, unions, just anybody I can get my hands on to talk about what's going on, what's really going on in the community. And there's a group called Líderes Campesinas, which is farm worker women leaders. They're a nonprofit that train women to be leaders in the farm worker community. They're terrific, and we have a partnership going with them. I've been collecting PPE, the personal protective equipment,
yes,
and trying to get them into farm workers' hands. And along with the food banks, we've done some distribution. And I got a cash donation from an organization, La Una, the laborers union, and Líderes Campesinas is going to be making the face masks with that money and passing them out to farm workers and saying, you really need to use these, and this is the way you protect yourself. They're a terrific organization, and they've come up with a 9-point letter that they've sent to the governor. And one of the points they make in their letter is that they're afraid as farm workers to go to work. And they want a sticker for their vehicle that says essential worker. They want to be recognized and respected for the work that they do. And
absolutely.
I realize it's as much an emotional issue as a practical issue. They want recognition. They don't want to get stopped by a police officer who says, where are you going and why are you going? There's 4 of you in a car, where are you going, kind of thing. And I don't think that's really going to happen. I've talked to the sheriffs in the counties that I represent. But I think they make a really good point, which is that we need to recognize they are going to work, and they're going to work so that we can have food on our table. And it can be food that we know is grown under the best conditions and that it's in abundance. We don't go to the store and there's enough anymore, like the toilet paper and some of the other products.
Listening to your story, handling personal protection equipment and dealing with the local agencies, you sound like you're not only a legislator, but you're a social worker at this point.
Well, you know what? It's interesting because I think that's probably what I would have gone into had I not become a lawyer, is that there are so many needs in the community that the more that we can get out there, understand them, and then try to connect the dots, the better off we're going to be. We need to make sure that everybody feels like there's someone out there that cares for them. And
yes,
we did a PPE distribution with some food products from the food bank a couple days ago in Madera, and went to a farm, and the farm workers were so happy that someone showed up and that they cared. And I was very moved by that, because you don't get to see that sometimes in the job that we do. We're so removed from it all that I felt very, very emotional about the whole thing. I feel like there's a reason that we do this work beyond passing a law that tells people what they have to do. It's about caring for people.
Thank you for your honesty and your transparency in sharing that. And I think you bring up a good point. We need to look at our attitudes in the state and in this country. People go to the grocery store. There's all this fresh produce. Most people give zero thought to where that food comes from. And I'll admit, I'm that way too sometimes. And we don't want to be reminded of the suffering and sacrifice. Just, I don't want to hear about it. Just buy me the food. And that attitude in itself is a metaphor for a lot of the problems in our country and state right now, which we can talk about in a few minutes. But any comments in reaction to that perspective?
Sure. One of the things that I think is real important is that we recognize what food comes from this country and what food we're importing. I'm not going to put down imported food because the bottom line is we get a lot of fruits and vegetables during the winter when we don't grow them anywhere in this country from South America and Mexico. But we need to recognize that in California, we have some of the highest regulatory requirements in the world. I would say the highest. And it costs to do that. It costs our farmers and it costs our system. And in the end, people need to recognize that the food just doesn't appear in the store, that there are people that make sure that it gets there and that it gets there and it's fresh and it is of the highest quality. And I'm a big supporter of Buy Californian, and I think that having it marked in the grocery store visibly is really important. And we need to stop buying, well, this is my 2 cents worth, is that a lot of the cheap stuff that we buy, because the store is a discount store, does a real disservice to workers and the businesses in California.
What about the relationship between the farm workers and the farmers themselves, the folks who own the fields, who are doing their best to try to harvest a crop and move things out, trying to be respectful of the workers who work for them? I know that they are out there. Has there been some partnership, some in tandem effort, or is there friction between the two parties?
No, I think there's been some real partnerships. What I know is that I'm hearing that farm workers don't know how to protect themselves, and they don't know about the protective equipment. And then they need cooperation from the farmers so that the social distancing happens at the work site, wherever the work site is. So it's complicated, and every county is doing something entirely different, including Stanislaus County, who's urging that the stay-at-home order be lifted, despite the fact that we're not through the surge yet. So it's hard to overgeneralize, but it's really important that we get the word out about this is how you protect yourself. And I think we're starting to see that the virus is hitting the farm worker community. And my concern is that once it hits, it's going to move very quickly.
And when it hits, where do people go if they're sick? Because I know the healthcare infrastructure is kind of precarious in those districts right now.
That's exactly right. And so we've told everybody that if you don't feel well and you need to talk to a health professional, go in for the service. Everybody's going to get covered. We can't distinguish between those that have insurance and those that don't, or those that are covered and those that aren't. Right now, California needs to get a handle on this, and everybody needs to at least have an opportunity to talk to a medical professional. And frankly, in many of the communities, there are no medical professionals. So that whole telemedicine becomes critically important because there's an opportunity to be able to talk to someone even if you don't have a ride for an hour to get to a major facility.
Senator, help me with my Spanish here. What is the Spanish translation for social distancing, and what does it mean for the communities?
Well, the translation is distanciamiento social, which is distance social, right? But I've been saying distanciamiento personal, which is personal distancing, because that's a little bit more descriptive. And then it leads into the discussion about how you need to be at least 6 feet away. And I do the example of sticking out your arms, and the person next to you shouldn't be any closer if they do the same thing. And what I ended up doing is I did 3 town halls, which were translated into Spanish, simultaneous translation. It was a virtual town hall. And I realized as I was going around and having conversations with some of the organizations that are representing farm workers that I really needed to do it just for farm workers. And so I did one in Spanish, and it was translated into Mixteco, which is one of the indigenous languages in Oaxaca, one of the states in Mexico. And the speakers spoke specifically to the conditions that farm workers will find themselves in. And we had a public health officer, a doctor, a nurse, California Rural Legal Assistance talked about being a tenant and how they can protect themselves. All of these people rent for the most part, and a judge, because the Judicial Council and the Chief Justice just issued an order about how renters can protect themselves. It's basically a protection against eviction during this difficult time because they can't pay the rent. So it was really well received, and I keep thinking I got to do more of this because it's important to talk specifically to what are the conditions that they face themselves and from someone who speaks their language.
Wow. Senator, I realize for so many people in these communities, there is no plan B, and the work you're doing is so helpful. And I am humbled by the realization that many in these communities are already living precariously. But I hope when the history of this pandemic is written for California, that all of us should remember that these workers, who are also the parents and the aunts and the uncles and the brothers and the sisters, they stayed in the fields, they stayed at work, and they, how do we say, kept calm and carried on.
Absolutely. It's really true. And that's why going out to a farm and seeing the faces of the workers, that was very moving, because these are people that they came to earn a good living and to change the lives of their family. And you have to respect that, because every single one of us, our families came here for the exact same reason, except for those that were brought against their will, obviously, right? But there are lots of stories of families that came to California and they've contributed to the economy. And they didn't ask for a handout. They didn't ask for anybody to take care of them. They're doing the work that has to get done. And, you know, during the 50s, the United States took a real hardcore position against immigrants. And there was an effort to get U.S. citizens to work in the field. And the story that I read was that one of the high schools, a bunch of the kids decided they were going to go out and work as a show of, we don't need immigrants, we can do it ourselves. And so the boys went out to the fields and they didn't last a day. That was it. There was no interest in U.S. workers to go and work in the fields. It's hard work. It takes a skill level. You make more money in some of the crops if you're good at it, like strawberries. You make over $20 an hour in the field when the strawberries are in season if you're good. But it takes a lot of practice, and it's hard, backbreaking labor. So we need to appreciate that the food that we eat and so carelessly shop for, that there are people that have really put their blood, sweat, and tears into it and make it possible for our economy to thrive. Because I live in rural California. I love it. And it's the hard work of immigrants that make it possible.
Love this perspective. Thank you. All right, let's take the stories and the needs of your communities and let's bring them up to Sacramento here. You and your colleagues are still legislating, even at a distance, and reckoning with a state budget that looks nothing like it did 4 months ago when the governor introduced it. And we have the $17.5 billion reserve, thank God. But our economy is entering into its own quarantine, if you will. We have millions of people applying for unemployment, and this prolonged pandemic recession could eat away at that surplus just like that, reminding us of something we saw probably worse maybe even than the recession of a decade ago. You are a member, Senator, of both the newly created Senate Budget Subcommittee on COVID-19 response and the newly created Special Senate Committee on Pandemic Response, two different committees with somewhat different charges, but you're on the front lines of this. What are you and your colleagues looking at? Further legislation to protect Californians from economic chaos, protecting the undocumented workers, low-income, homeless Californians, protecting all of us, really. I guess you have to be innovative.
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question, is that, you know, we all filed bills in January and February about ideas that would make California stronger or better. And so those bills are sitting there. So there's two things. The other thing is that the governor released a budget in January that had significant amount of extra spending in it, new programs, new reorganizations of the state departments. And he has since said, basically, throw that out the window. We're starting all over. This is going to be a bare bones budget. So don't expect any new spending. And he's going to be releasing that plan in a couple of weeks. And so, you know, whatever we thought we were going to spend money on because the revenue was coming in so strongly, we're going to have to shift. And then all those bills that we filed back in January and February, we've been told in the Senate side that we should not expect to proceed as usual because, first of all, we're not in Sacramento. We're not doing hearings. There's a process you have to go through to move those bills. That we should be focusing on COVID-19 bills, things that are going to make dealing with the pandemic better, and any other emergencies that we've been working on. California is disaster prone, and so we're trying to really narrow down our focus. And my guess, the kinds of things I'm interested in are this. We've had kids out of school now for over a month. Some kids are getting instruction electronically, but a majority of the kids are getting nothing. And there are many parts of my district where there is no broadband access, period. So even if you give the kids a computer or a tablet, and even if you give them a hotspot, there's no service. So you cannot teach digitally. And so that digital divide is real. I'm very interested in making sure we put the resources necessary to start expanding rural access to the internet, number one, because if this proceeds and kids need to continue learning digitally, some kids will be, they're already far behind. They're going to be eons behind, and we just can't afford it. So digital access, that will help us with the telemedicine. And we absolutely have to invest in our rural clinics because that's where people get their primary care information from and where they can access telemedicine. And so that's going to be critically important. And then we're going to have to cover everybody with our healthcare program. It's going to be very, very important that we not leave any gaps so that this virus can't attack our weakest point, which is those that are not covered by any kind of program at all. Our housing situation is atrocious, and it gets worse because we're trying to house people separately that have the virus, and yet people are living in significantly overcrowded situations. So we need to be able to make sure that we're producing the housing or we have some alternative housing for a period of time. The governor getting his hands on trailers is terrifically important, but it's not a permanent solution. And frankly, if we can invest in housing, then that's going to help our economy. Part of what we're looking at is how do we get our economy going as quickly as possible as well. So, I could go on and on and on. Those are the issues that are front and foremost in my mind, and I know there are lots of others, and we're going to have to work through a system to be able to handle some of this. Right now, the governor is doing everything by executive order, and that's terrific, but this is a form of government where the legislature weighs in as well, and we're going to need to make sure that we're at the table as well.
How has Governor Newsom done with this, in your opinion, taking the lead and being the face of California's pandemic survival? He has to follow through. He's got 120 legislators to work with, like you say. Columnists have opined, asking, does he have the grit to take this on moving forward? What do you think? Has he stolen your spotlight, considering what you've just said?
You know what? Frankly, I don't worry about that. I think he's done a terrific job during a very difficult time, and he's been decisive, and he's moved in a direction to protect people. So for that, I give him a lot of credit. I worked in the administration, so I know that.
That's right. You're no stranger to gubernatorial dynamics, are you?
No, and the way that things work in an administration is it's the governor that speaks. It's not the secretary, right?
Right.
The secretaries are his cabinet members, and I was honored to work with Governor Brown. I thought he did a terrific job, but I didn't have any authority to open my mouth and give the administration perspective. It was the governor. And if he wanted me to speak, he would tell me to speak. And so I think the governor has done exactly what he needs to do. It's difficult. There are 120 of us, and we all have our own perspectives on how things should happen, which is part of the reason why sometimes we get gridlocked. But I have to say, given the severity of this pandemic, given the political situation where there's hay to be made to pretend it's not a real serious pandemic, I think he's done exactly what needs to be done. And, there are these hot spots. There will be 1 or 2 days where all of the hospitals in my district are clamoring because they're concerned about PPE and the masks, and they're not getting them, and they're being asked to prepare, and they're not going to be prepared. And then he goes and he buys masks, and that's not the issue anymore. So you've got to give credit to the governor for recognizing when a situation is likely to spiral out of control. Are the masks here now? No, not yet. Are they exactly what we need? We don't know until they get delivered. And he has kept the information on the contract to himself. And I understand why, because there are issues with imports and there are issues with other states and other organizations coming in and paying more money for them and taking the shipment away from you. So it's not a business as usual. We need action. We need to get those darn masks over here. We don't need to be in litigation. So he's kept the contract a secret. I don't have any problem with that. We'll get a chance to see it and be critical if we want later. But right now you deal with the emergency, and I'm okay with that.
Well, he has also done some terrific work on behalf of, where the federal government has not, on behalf of a lot of the constituents in your district, incentives and financial support, stimulus, if you will, for the undocumented workers and farm workers.
That's right. So what's happening is that the legislature has been in the district and talking to constituents, and then we send information up to the governor's office, and he's included in his executive orders the issues that we've raised. So the system is messy, and it hasn't worked exactly like people would like it to. But I've got to say, from my perspective, that every time that I've called his office and said, here are the issues that are of concern in my district, he's taken consideration and included. And having assets, having resources for the undocumented members of my community that are not working is really important. And it really is an act of good faith from the state of California. And quite frankly, a lot of the money, almost half of the money, is from private foundations.
Right.
That's really important.
Some of your colleagues are still out there saying that helping undocumented residents and workers is a luxury item. The state can't afford it right now. Considering everything that we have talked about up to this point, what's your reaction to that concern coming from your fellow colleagues, some of them in the legislature right now?
Well, you know what? I would agree with that if we allowed undocumented workers to access the funds that they've paid into. So they've paid into unemployment, they've paid into disability, they've paid in through their employment. They will never receive that money. They paid into Social Security. So this whole argument that it's a luxury item, I think, is really specious. I don't think you can say that people who have lived here, who have paid their taxes, they pay sales tax, they pay property tax if they own property. I don't think you can say that it's a luxury when they paid taxes into a system and they cannot receive any benefit because of it. I think it's a down payment on money owed. And frankly, if the federal government would legalize their status, then this discussion is moot because there's no need to have a fund for undocumented workers that are unemployed because the system would have the benefits for them that they need. So to me, it's not a luxury. It is a way to get money into their pocket because our system doesn't allow them to get the money that they paid into.
Senator, everything you're sharing here reminds me, especially looking at what the governor has done, what you and your colleagues are poised to do. Unlike other parts of the U.S., California and other western states, Oregon, Washington, we don't traditionally look at government as the enemy here. It's an essential part of life. And again, when we look at the history of this, when the history is written of how California has dealt with the pandemic, we're going to look at what the public officials did, what the government did, you and your colleagues. You have all saved thousands of lives.
That's right. That's really true. That's what this is all about. So that the naysayers that say sheltering in place has destroyed the economy for no good reason, that's not true. It's absolutely not true. We're trying to save lives.
Senator, I want to give a random shout out to women. You talked about earlier your career with a law degree and wanting to help the communities as a Latina, you know, from the cash register to the emergency room to the pharmacy, the home health aide, the home executive trying to teach your kids in the living room, to the women's caucus in the legislature, the soldiers on the front lines of this pandemic. Guess who they are? Women, mujeres. Underpaid, undervalued, underrecognized. But you know what? They do the work with this altruistic incentive. It's like, we got to get this done, so let's get it done.
You're absolutely right. And let me just tell you that one of the things that brings this home to me is that I have 3 wonderful women in my family that are working in hospitals. And I worry about them every day. My sister is a registered nurse, and she regularly sends me updates on how she's doing and the PPE that they have or don't have at their hospital. My sister-in-law is a social worker, and my niece, her daughter, works as a dietitian at a hospital. She's in charge of the food preparation. And so they're surrounded by the coronavirus because we've sent them to hospitals. And I worry about them all the time. And they're strong, strong women, and Latinas, all of them. And so you're absolutely right. It's the people on the front line tend to be women, although the talking heads tend to be men. There's a lot of women out there that are just, they show up for work, they run into danger, and I really appreciate the work that they do. And like I told you, the Líderes Campesinas group has been fabulous because they're interested in getting the word out and teaching women how to be leaders, farm worker women.
And I love that story about the sisterhood in your own family. That's a perfect example.
Yeah, shout out to them. So I probably should say my sister is Sandy Caballero, my sister-in-law is Linda Gutierrez, and my niece is Veronica Caballero. So go women.
Thank you. Let's kind of wrap this up, put things in perspective. Senator, one of the realities that has reared its head in all of this, our fundamental crisis that we're facing is not COVID-19 in the long run. It is our lack of capacity to respond to crises in ways that heal and help all of us. And we say constantly, we're in this together, we're all in the same boat, but it's not like that. We may be in the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. And the unequal impact of this pandemic has bitterly proved that point. And I think that we're going to have to do a truly honest and raw reckoning, and that may already be happening in the legislature and in communities, about how fragile our social and healthcare and community infrastructures are. But it could be a catalyst for change here, that this pandemic is that. And I fear sometimes we're going to go back to normal, and a lot of those things are going to fall through the cracks. But why not keep this vigilance up? Not panic, but vigilance, whether it's state issues, fiscal issues, social issues, and keep moving forward with this attitude.
Oh, it's so complicated because I absolutely agree with you. I think out of a crisis, there's an opportunity to rethink things. But the basis of the system is that, over time, the distance between the people that earn a really good living and those that don't has grown larger and larger. And the reality of the situation, having lived through being in government during the last recession, is that the gap grew wider instead of readjusting. People lost their houses and they've never recovered. Those houses were bought for investment, and the investors are making a lot of money off of renters. And the reason we passed rent control is because those individuals that own the properties had free reign to raise the rent tremendously. So the question I have is whether there's a societal, maybe this is a broader picture, is society ready? Because it's not just up to government. I think it's got to be this major investment of change. Is the corporate world ready to have a conversation about how can we create change in such a way so that everybody benefits? So that if you're showing up to work every day, you have the same opportunity to get insurance and a 401k as the top CEOs of the companies. And are people willing to make their investments? I mean, here's the trend that I see that makes it very, very difficult. You have more and more people buying online and less investment in local mom and pop stores. And that's because the online purchases or the big box purchases are much cheaper. And you don't go to the mom and pop. I used to be able to go to downtown Salinas, and I'd go to a wedding, and I'd walk in and I say, I need a really nice vase, about $50, $100, whatever. And they would find it, wrap it, and I could just go and pick it up. It's because I knew the lady that worked there, and I could just show up with my charge card. And, so it's personal service.
Right.
That's gone. Those mom and pop stores are gone. You can't do that anymore. You have to do it online, which means the sales tax goes not all to your community, and you don't get to touch and feel and see things. And so the question is, are people willing to make the fundamental changes that really has people saying we are all in this together? Because the challenge is that's the tagline. we're all in this together. But then you still have people saying, well, giving undocumented workers is a luxury, right? And no, it's not. It's not a luxury. Look at the reality. Look at the data. And so let's talk about how we're in this together and what does that mean and what kinds of changes are we willing to make in our society so that everybody feels like there's a seat at the table and that they're important and they're valued. Because if we can get there, the kinds of social issues that we see, the social isolation, the drug abuse, all of these things that create gangs and people that are willing to hurt each other, we can reduce them. We can heal people. And that's a real question. Can we get there? And does this pandemic allow us to move in that direction? I don't know. I'm an optimist. That's why I continue to work in government. But there are so many forces way beyond our control that have an impact. So I think we got to keep people at the table talking, but I'm not sure. I'm hopeful, but it's a challenge.
Beautifully said. Well, we will keep those questions and the discussion here on this table. My final question to you, what's ahead for you and your communities and your colleagues? I know you and your colleagues are in touch with each other, even if you are not with each other in person. And I realize nowadays asking about what's next is like asking you to envision the edge of the universe. It's hard to comprehend beyond just an hour from now, much less a few months from now. But what do you foresee for your communities, for California? What do you hope for?
Well, we're supposed to go back and start working on the 4th of May. And I want to see us get back to a time where commerce is back and people are going to work. I have a feeling it's going to take more time. And in the meantime, my goal is to try to collect as much PPE as possible to continue to do community education, make sure our food banks get the resources they need. But by the way, I really do think that the federal government has an opportunity to buy excess produce and give it to the food banks as part of a guarantee to farmers that there will be a market, because our farmers are really struggling right now because the market for fresh fruits and vegetables has gone down the toilet. People are not buying because they don't have money, and restaurants aren't open. So, I'm looking forward to the day that we can open up, but I'm really worried because I have parts of my district that are pushing to be the guinea pigs, and I just don't think we can afford to have people die because we're anxious to get back to work.
Senator, I am so glad to talk to you. I know that securing PPE devices and losing sleep for all of this and networking like this in the community was not fully on your agenda for 2020, but yet it is, I know, and I'm sure you're proud of it, part of being a public servant. And your district and your communities are part of the heart and soul of the state, and we wish everybody there safety and good health. And to you, thank you for your insight and perspective, and I wish you good luck and health. And thank you for joining us on Then There's California.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's been a pleasure.
Great to talk to you, Senator. You too, and I look forward to seeing you sooner than later in person, safely, here in Sacramento. And that is a wrap for this edition of Then There's California. It's a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, with technical assistance and great ideas and support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Sebeniano, Gunjan Patel, McLeana Woods, Lisa Murphy, Ricardo Sainz-Ion, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Ana Caballero of the 12th Senate District in California's Central Valley, I'm Brian Green. Be well and stay safe, everybody, and thanks for listening to Then There's California.